Okay, I think that was everybody that was coming in. Um, Good morning. Welcome to this session, Generative Artificial Intelligence Considerations for Graduate Research. My name is Erin Aspenleader. I am the Special Advisor to the Provost on Generative AI here at McMaster. I'm also a McMaster alumni. I did my PhD in English and Cultural Studies at McMaster a while ago. So pleased to be joining fellow or former graduate students. Welcome. If you're a new graduate student, if you're coming back, thanks so much for taking the time this morning. The session today, I'm joined by Kim Mason and Ben Taylor. We're going to talk about using artificial intelligence in graduate research in ways that maintain and uphold academic integrity and answer some of your questions about writing support and how to use AI responsibly in your graduate work. If you would like a copy of the slides, you can use the bit.ly code at the top of the screen, bit.ly/MacGradAI, and that should give you access to the slides or the QR code at the bottom of the screen. You can also make use of the chat throughout the webinar if you have questions, if you'd like me to repeat or slow down or explain a concept again, please feel welcome to use that chat. And the other piece of housekeeping to share is that most of the images in this presentation are AI generated. I used a tool called Midjourney to create them, and the prompt for the images is in the alt text of the presentation. So if you're curious about the prompt that I used, you can go ahead and find it there. I think that's it for getting started, so let's move forward. McMaster is located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. I'm joining you today from Guelph, Ontario, the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit. And in thinking about land acknowledgements and artificial intelligence, I wanted to take a moment to highlight the work of some Indigenous researchers who are part of a research consortium around the world, but located one of their primary research headquarters at Concordia University. And the group indigenous-ai.net has been researching for the last couple of years, I guess 5 now, thinking about how Indigenous ways of knowing intersect with artificial intelligence in ways that are hopeful for humanity. There's a lot of risk around artificial intelligence, and this research consortium is really trying to think about ways that AI can be used for the betterment of humanity. And so if you're interested in their work, you can find out more at www.indigenous-ai.net. In thinking about artificial intelligence, you've heard the terms certainly in the last couple of years in terms of ChatGPT and Copilot and all of the kinds of terms. I wanted to start with this slide. You're not behind, and we've been here before. And the quote that I use here, artificial intelligence may win the prize as the computer industry's most abused buzzword, affixed to everything from toy robots to ordinary tax planning software. Frequently, it's no more than an advertising ploy, an effort to capture the aura of HAL, which is the robot from 2001 Space Odyssey. It's becoming an axiom of the software industry that every chief executive has to say he's working on AI. Otherwise, we'd feel impotent. And I throw emphasis on he because this quote is from 1985. And so that feeling of AI hype and the need to be attentive to AI is one that's been around for decades now, that attention to how artificial intelligence is intersecting with lots of different areas of research and areas of society is one where we're certainly in a heightened moment of that right now. In every call for papers, in every webinar, in every conversation, it feels like somebody's talking about AI. And there can be certainly for me a feeling of, how am I supposed to keep up with this? How am I supposed to figure out how these tools work, how they intersect with my work, with my life? How do I make decisions about how to use these tools ethically or not use them? And so if you're having some of those feelings, you're in very good company, and know that the technology is changing quite quickly, but here at McMaster, we're standing by to provide you support and resources to help make sense of what the tools mean and how they intersect with your disciplinary research. So with that, sort of how to introduce you as new graduate students or graduate students, what we're going to do today is spend a little bit of time just defining our terms. What do we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence? How does how do those definitions matter for our roles as graduate students and graduate student researchers? Why might it matter for your work as a researcher? How can you use it ethically and responsibly? What advice are granting agencies offering? What advice does McMaster have? We'll talk a little bit then about how to use generative AI tools, and then I will pass it over to my colleagues, Kim and Ben, to talk a little bit about how AI intersects with their areas of campus. If you hate this plan, if you're like, this is not what I signed up for, I don't want to attend this session, you can certainly, now would be a great moment to go reclaim an hour of your time. If there are other things that you wanted to talk about related to AI, please do put them in the chat. I'm really open to adapting and shifting the focus of the presentation to make sure that I'm able to address all of your questions. So let's start with what do we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence. There are lots of different definitions. The most common one now is that AI is the development of computer systems that can do tasks that would normally require human intelligence. And so thinking about your morning so far today, you've probably encountered AI in a couple of different ways and places. If you just want to throw in the chat where you think you've encountered AI, that computer systems that can do a task that would normally require human intelligence, I would be very grateful if you wanted to put in the chat where you think you've seen AI. I wonder if you can all use the chat. I assume you can. I'll wait and see if somebody has an example. Maybe you can't. Okay. Well, oh, hooray! Thank you so much, folks. Finding an audiobook, making calculations, playing chess. I hope you won, Justina. I also love that before 9 o'clock this morning, you played a game of chess. That's very solid use of your time. Writing code. Terrific. Yeah, you've encountered AI in lots of different places. Maybe you had a conversation with Siri or Alexa or your Google Home. Those virtual assistants are certainly using AI. Handwriting recognition, autocomplete in an email or in a text message. If you opened your phone using facial recognition, that's a form of AI. Translation, self-driving cars I'm seeing in the chat, using generative AI tools for coding, definitely. Recommendation engines, if you watched Netflix this morning or used Spotify or Amazon, and predictive mapping. Finding specific tutorials through the Meta's AI chat. Yeah, there's certainly many products now are building AI right into the platform. So Zoom has an AI assistant. McMaster doesn't have it active at this time, but it's certainly showing up in lots of different places. So thank you for those examples and for proving that the chat works. I appreciate that. I start with this as a sort of reminder that AI really is all around us. And colloquially, we've come to think of AI as generative AI. When we hear artificial intelligence, sometimes we're sort of conflating that with generative artificial intelligence, but there are different terms. And if you think about artificial intelligence as a big umbrella term that incorporates a number of different subfields, including machine learning and deep learning, generative artificial intelligence is a subfield of AI that uses machine learning and deep learning to analyze and process a gigantic data set, and from that data set to make predictive outputs of what the most likely next image or text would be in a sequence. That predictive part of generative AI is important because sometimes those predictions are incorrect or inaccurate. You've probably heard the term now hallucination, where these generative AI models will factually or sort of declaratively output an output that is incorrect or just hallucinated, not real. And so as graduate student researchers, when you're using a generative AI model, if you have approval from your supervisor to be using it, you want to be really aware that risk of hallucination is present and be very attentive to evaluating every output to make sure that it's accurate. From those sort of thinking about generative AI models, different companies are producing different kinds of models. You've heard of ChatGPT created by OpenAI. It's built on GPT 3.5 4.0. Microsoft's Copilot also uses GPT-4 as the underlying model. I'm going to say a little bit more about Copilot and McMaster in a second, but also wanted to highlight that Meta has a tool or a model, Llama, that's open source that lots of people are building their own tools on top of. You might be, if you're in a discipline that's an area of your research interest, for sure exploring that. Google has a tool, Gemini, Anthropic has one, Claude, and there's many, many other tools that are available. In thinking about Microsoft Copilot, I just want for a second, if you can open your own browser window and go to copilot.microsoft.com. And when you sign in, if you could sign in using your McMaster email credentials, that would be terrific. So you sign in with your McMaster email and password. And when you do that, you should see up in the top right-hand corner this small green shield. That's important for you to know as graduate researchers because McMaster has an enterprise-wide license with Microsoft Copilot for all staff, students, and faculty. And when you're using your McMaster credentials and you're signed into Copilot, you're in what's called a closed tenant, and your prompt information does not go to Microsoft and it does not go to McMaster. It's in this sort of closed environment, such that when you close your browser window, the conversation history and your prompt and whatever data you've exchanged in that prompt disappears. Important to know that it disappears because if you've created something valuable, you want to copy and paste it somewhere else. But really important because when you close it and it disappears, you can work with confidential proprietary information using Copilot. So if you're working on your research and you're concerned about using one of the other tools for that data security and privacy, if you're signed into Copilot using your McMaster credentials, you can confidently work with that data. Does anyone have any questions about Copilot and signing in with your McMaster credentials and the data security there? Okay. I know that different tools have different capabilities. What can you use Copilot for? Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about what generative AI tools, what you can use them for as a graduate student researcher in just a second. But for sure, different tools have different capabilities. So Copilot, using your McMaster credentials, you're able to add attachments, you're able to work with images, but it doesn't have the capabilities of creating custom GPTs in the way that Anthropic's Claude and OpenAI's ChatGPT can. Somebody's saying in my McMaster profile, but you can't see the green icon. That's really common. If you actually just refresh your browser, sometimes that fixes it, or sometimes you have to use a different browser for whatever reason. What are the ethical limitations of using Copilot for class-related work? Great question, Simran, and we will definitely get there. Because for some instances, you should not be using Copilot, definitely. All right, so I'm going to keep going and talk about why might it matter. So getting towards some of those ethical limitations. I talked already about the risks of hallucination with these tools. And so if you're using a generative AI tool for your graduate student research, really, really driving home that you want to evaluate the output to make sure it's accurate. You also want to evaluate the output for bias. The way that these tools are built, they analyze that vast, vast data set of the publicly available internet. And in that data set, there are lots of hateful, harmful, garbage things written that go into the training. And the way the companies have trained their tools, they try to set guardrails to reduce some of that harmful output, but still implicit bias shows up. And so that might be in an image. If you've asked the generative AI tool to create an image of a CEO, it's likely going to be a white man. If you've asked for a story, you might see some implicit bias showing up in those stories or a draft article. And so trying to think about a generative AI tool sort of like a undergraduate research assistant who might be working with you, you want to be really thoughtful about the output and thinking about, like, is it accurate what my research assistant created, and is there bias here that I need to correct for? Some of the other issues of concern, certainly the ability of these tools to create very realistic image, audio, video, has introduced a lot of risk around disinformation, misinformation, and certainly in our current political climate, something to be attentive to. Here at McMaster, we're really trying to make AI literacy and helping students, undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty really aware of the capabilities of these tools so that we can bring that sort of critical thinking that's a key piece of post-secondary education to bear when we're interacting with images, audio, text on the internet and beyond. Governance is a key issue for artificial intelligence, where there are laws nationally, internationally, trying to understand how those laws are shaping AI safety and security. At McMaster, what we have in terms of governance around AI is we have a set of guidelines for graduate students who are working as teaching assistants, for faculty members, for students around how to use AI responsibly. And I'll talk more about those guidelines in a minute. We also have guidelines for staff, and we're working towards guidelines for researchers. And those guidelines intersect with some of our policies. So Kim will talk towards the end about our academic integrity policy, which speaks directly to responsible use of AI. Data security and privacy is a key concern for graduate student researchers. Many of these tools are very interested in collecting good quality data to help train their models. If you're working on novel research, you don't want to give that data away to one of these companies. So if you're going to use it for your research, please use Microsoft Copilot, or be very sure that the tool that you're using has been through a privacy impact and algorithmic assessment, that you feel like my data is very secure in this environment. There are concerns about how these tools used and collected data in terms of copyright. And so different news organizations, different data sources are suing some of those companies, saying that it was copyright violation. None of those lawsuits have yet been settled. And so for now, we're in the sort of space of open question about whether the companies that used the data have violated any copyright law. There isn't a reliable way, to detect AI generated content. So if you're working as a graduate student as a TA, you might encounter in your work questions about how do I detect AI generated writing, and really Kim will talk about this as well, that sort of emphasis on making sure that you're clear with your students, or that your supervisor is clear with you about how you can use generative AI in your courses. And if you're not supposed to be using it, not to use it. And if you're a faculty member, if your course supervisor, if your supervisor suspects that maybe you use generative AI inappropriately, they're going to start a conversation with you to say, tell me about this concept, tell me about your process developing this, really trying to understand, do you know what went into the creation of your work? And the same would be true in your role as a TA. Similarly, in terms of citation, here at MAC, we're really encouraging folks to, yes, this session's being recorded. We're encouraging folks to acknowledge and cite where they've used AI, just as I did in this presentation, by starting out by saying AI generated images, here's where the prompts are. If you're using AI in your writing, you'd have a conversation with your course instructor or your supervisor about how to cite AI use. AI can't be listed as a co-author on a research paper, but you can certainly acknowledge I used, Copilot to help me draft this component of the assignment, and that was allowed by my course instructor. And then finally, there's certainly concern around automation of roles and work and the future of work and what that means for all of us. I should also add here the environmental impact of these tools. That's what my image was generated around, is thinking about the use of energy and water in the development of the models, and then the continued use. And so if you're thinking about using AI in your work, trying to decide what tool you want to use based on its environmental impact might be something to consider. Likewise, the how they have been trained and the social impact of laborers. Somebody had a question earlier about how can I actually use this as a graduate student? So the key message here is that at McMaster, every course instructor gets to set how generative AI can be used in that course. So if you're taking graduate courses as part of your master's or your PhD coursework, the course instructor should have on the syllabus a statement that says you can use generative AI in this way in this course, or you can't use generative AI in this course. If there is no statement on the syllabus, talk to the course instructor, make sure that you understand what is allowed or isn't allowed in your course. Some of the course instructors will say you can use it in these ways, and here are some of the possibilities. Likewise, if you're done coursework or you're starting a thesis, you can talk to your supervisor and make sure you document in writing, here's what's allowed in terms of use of generative AI, and here's how I'm going to use it. Some of the possibilities there that you could talk with your supervisor would be around creating any kind of document. So creating, summarizing, customizing documents that could be emails, that could be literature reviews. McMaster has access to a tool called Cite AI that you can get to through the McMaster library. And what Cite AI does is its data set, its training resources are all peer-reviewed publications and academic imprints, so preprints and publications. If you're using Cite AI, when you ask it a question in the output, it will give you direct links to the peer-reviewed article or book that's available in the McMaster library. It's a great resource for feeling more confident that the output hasn't been hallucinated, and a great resource for sort of pointing you to those sources within the McMaster library. Oh, I'm just seeing a quick question there about water in the making of the models. Because the way the models are trained, they need a ton of data processing. And to cool the data centers, they use both electricity and water to cool within the data centers. I'm happy to put a link to some more information about the environmental impact of the tools in the chat after. If I use Cite AI, how can I document it if it's for publications I couldn't manually find on another data set? McMaster's library has a citation guide available for McMaster Library Generative AI Citation Guide that gives you some examples of how you can cite your use of generative AI. So if you go to, I'll put the LibGuide link in the chat, and it gives you some examples for how you could cite that. And I will put some more resources about the environmental impact in for sure. Okay. Other ways that you could use it, copy editing. So if you're not a strong editor or writer, you can use a generative AI tool like Copilot to provide some editorial advice if your supervisor or course instructor has said that's appropriate. Likewise, for coming up with outlines for papers, for presentations, using it for translation, providing data analysis, interpretation, and visualization. Copilot is really excellent at taking, a set of Excel data and visualizing that in graphs. Providing feedback and counter arguments on drafts, I found that really helpful when I'm writing a report or an article to put it into Copilot and say, what are some of the logical errors that I've made, or where are there some gaps in my argument? Role playing in scenarios, if you have to have a difficult conversation with a colleague or your supervisor, you could have a sort of practice scenario using Copilot to sort of play out what that conversation might look like. Are there other examples of how you've been using generative AI or how you imagine using it in your research? I know earlier people were talking about coding. Certainly Copilot in other generative AI tools are really strong in developing code and as well as correcting and helping fix code. Suggesting titles, yeah, for sure. Giving alternative titles, ideas like that for essays. Terrific. You can add any other examples, but really, again, want to emphasize that you need to get approval from your supervisor or for the course instructor for any use of generative AI for the course. Otherwise, you are risking academic dishonesty. Does Copilot use GPT-4 or GPT 3.5? It uses GPT-4, and that does apply for Copilot. What Microsoft sort of ruined my life, and it named two products Copilot. It named Copilot the chatbot. Oops. This one here, it's called Microsoft Copilot. They also named Microsoft Copilot 365. Microsoft Copilot 365 is a product that interacts with your Word, with your SharePoint, with your OneDrive, and it pulls information from those sources to create something. McMaster does not have access to Microsoft Copilot 365, and in part that is because it introduces a lot of data privacy considerations in the way that it interacts with SharePoint and OneDrive. So when you're using Microsoft Copilot with your McMaster credentials, you're just using this sort of AI companion chatbot. How do I check if my work is similar to AI generated work? There isn't anything like a plagiarism checker. There are tools out there, they're just not reliable. And so we wouldn't suggest you use any of those sort of GPT-0 or Turnitin's AI detector. Okay. What are the sort of guidance I've talked to you about, making sure that you're clear with your supervisor, with your course instructor, but as graduate researchers, you'd also be thinking about journal publications and grant publications. The Canadian Federal Research Funding Agencies in April put out some draft guidance on the use of AI for grant proposals. So each academic journal has its own guidance about how you can use AI or not. And so if you're thinking about preparing a publication for one of those journals, the first thing I would do is to look at what the journal's regulations are on the use of AI and make sure that you're following those closely. In terms of applying for research funding, what the funding agencies have said is that as the named applicant, you are ultimately personally accountable for the contents of your application. And so that's trying to get at the idea of those hallucinations and bias, that it's up to you to be confident and sure that what you're producing there is accurate and free of bias. They've also said privacy, confidentiality, data security, and protection of intellectual property must be considered and prioritized in the development and review of grant applications. So there it's again, that caution to make sure that any material you're sharing with a tool is in a data secure and private environment. But I think really key there in the review of grant applications is pointing to the reviewers of your grants that they can't just take your grant application and put it into a generative AI tool to get feedback, because that would be a violation of privacy and confidentiality. I'm just going to pause because there's a couple things in the chat I want to make sure to address. You share your draft with Copilot to see errors. Would this show up and Turnitin? And then there's another question about Turnitin. So Turnitin has a plagiarism detector that McMaster uses, and we use that to check whether something that's been created matches something that's available elsewhere on the internet. Turnitin has an AI detector that McMaster has not activated. That AI detector is not reliable yet in sort of detecting whether or not something was AI or human generated enough of the time. It's not accurate enough of the time that McMaster felt confident turning it on. So if you're thinking about could my course instructor take my work, put it into Turnitin and know whether it was AI generated or not? No, but your course instructor could look at your work and say, this doesn't sound human generated. This doesn't sound like what my student would have come up with. I'm going to have a conversation with my student. And the way our academic integrity policy works is if they suspect that through that conversation that you didn't write or you didn't write on your own that piece of work, they can pursue an academic dishonesty investigation. And Kim will speak more to that, or Kim, if I've inaccurately addressed that here, please jump in. But don't take the fact that there isn't an AI detector as a justification for not following the rules around AI use in your courses. Any questions about the guidance from the federal funding agencies? Great. So how that is being applied here at McMaster, we don't currently have approved endorsed guidelines for graduate student researchers. We have an expert panel of folks working on creating those guidelines right now, and we're hoping to have them released in the fall. So I'm putting this out here as an interim approach with those guidelines on their way. that start with have a conversation with your supervisor about the appropriate use of generative AI in your research. Where could it be appropriate? Where would it be inappropriate? How would you cite or acknowledge its use? And so that will vary depending on your discipline. If you're in computer science, it makes a lot of sense for you to be using generative AI to correct and work on your code. Make that an explicit agreement with your supervisor, have that document. If you're a PhD student in history and you want to use generative AI to scan handwritten documents and summarize them for you, make sure that that's okay with your supervisor. In some cases, your supervisors might not know very much about generative AI. And so in that conversation, you might need to do a little bit of explaining to them of like, here's what the tool is, here's how it works, here's how it preserves my academic curiosity, my drive to create something new and interesting. Here's how I'm going to cite and acknowledge it. Here's how we can keep this conversation going. Whatever you do, don't share confidential personal health or proprietary information with a generative AI tool unless it's been through that privacy impact assessment or it's Microsoft Copilot. Reminder that it creates false, misleading, and biased outputs. You have to personally verify everything. And make sure that you've read the privacy policy and user agreement to make sure you've had all of your questions answered. So thinking about that sort of really explicit, clear conversation where you absolutely understand what you can and cannot do. And then once you've got that approval, that you're using a secure tool like Copilot, and that you're aware of, even if you're using Copilot, it can have, or Cite AI, it can have these sort of hallucinated and biased outputs. Any questions about those guidelines? Okay. I'm going to skip that, but if you want later, you can go through and use the code bit.ly/Gen AI cases and look at some possible case studies where I wanted you to think about how using generative AI for a literature review, a grant proposal, an experimental design, qualitative data analysis, simulation, and modeling, how that might shape and interact with your development as a graduate student researcher. In all of the use of generative AI, you really want to be weighing, it's possible that this tool could do this for me, but what am I losing and what am I giving up as a student, as a developing researcher that I might need to know myself? Knowing that there will always need to be a human who's evaluating those outputs, you need to have the content knowledge and the skills inherent and important within your discipline in order to be able to do that. So just because the generative AI tool could do the lit review faster, maybe of like a good quality, isn't necessarily justification for using the tool if you need to develop those skills yourself. Or maybe it's really great at writing the draft grant proposal, but it's essential for you to be able to think through the different elements of your grant. And so in each use case that you're talking about with your supervisor or the course instructor, really think about, is this tool replacing some essential skill or knowledge that I need as a graduate student? And I actually want to take the time and bring the intellectual curiosity to develop that skill myself. I don't know if it's a helpful example, but I use generative AI in lots of areas of my work, but I'm a great writer and I really enjoy writing. So I rarely use generative AI tools to do the writing for me because I enjoy and I learn, and part of the work that I'm doing is thinking through, how do I craft this argument and how do I structure whatever piece of writing I'm working on. I'm not great at data analysis and visualization. I know enough that I can evaluate the output. I know enough that I can think about like, oh, maybe that's not the best way to represent this. But I do use generative AI more in that way because it's not something that gives me joy and pleasure in my work, and it's not something that I'm as strong at that I am in writing. So we've talked about, you've got approval from your instructor. How would you go about using one of these tools like Copilot? There's lots of interest in having use cases, like tell me exactly how I could use it for a literature review. I've included a quote here from Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at the Wharton School at UPenn, and he writes, what generative AI is worth using it for will be different for everyone, and the value will vary by task. Different people with different preferences may find very different uses. If you're a strong writer with a particular voice, you may never want to use AI for writing. If you're continually paralyzed when faced with a blank page, AI may be more useful. No one can provide clear guidance or a magical prompt. You're going to have to figure it out yourself. And so again, that's sort of what I was just saying, that figuring out where AI is going to be useful for your research, where it's going to introduce efficiencies, where it's going to help you do something you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, is a strong reason to make use of that tool in your toolbox. If it's something that's going to replace an essential component of your graduate research or your pleasure as a curiosity as a researcher, don't use it. And in any case, make sure that you have approval to be doing so. Once you've figured out, yes, I want to use it for this thing, how do you go about prompting? So prompting is what we call what you put into the little chat window. The strategy I've included here is called role and goal, where you tell the tool who you want it to be. So I want you to be a graduate PhD student in English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. What do you want it to do? I want you to come up with a reading list for my comprehensive exams. Give me a draft reading list of 100 novels from across Canadian literature that I could put in my comps list. What do you not want it to do? If you have examples, provide those examples, and then ask for what questions it might have before you begin. And then you give feedback. Thinking about it really is quite conversational. Think about the generative AI tool as your undergraduate research assistant, and you need to give as much context and explanation to the tool as you would to this research assistant that's working with you. I've included at the bottom of the slide here a link to a prompt library developed by Ethan Mollick, that researcher, moreusefulthings.com/prompts. And it has some great prompts that you could use if you've had approval to use them, to get feedback, to be a tutor, to help you plan for teamwork, for group work, for critiquing, for being a devil's advocate, for goal setting, all kinds of different uses that you could explore. Back over here. Does anyone have any other strategies that they've used in prompting that have been helpful? We can do a couple of examples together in a second, but I just see Carlos's question. The use of AI involves several skills which will be valued in the future for sure. If you're thinking about, when you graduate, the roles that you'll be graduating into, certainly AI competence and literacy will be part of that. Will there be courses to learn using AI in general for every program? Right now, we're thinking about courses, modules, workshops across different domains. So undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty members. Some programs are beginning to think about where can we build digital literacy, AI literacy into the program as a whole. There aren't concrete plans at this moment to have courses within each program. That planning just, if truthfully, takes a long time in an institution as large and as complex as McMaster. That said, we have a website for generative AI at the university, which I will put into the chat. You don't have to scroll along. That has, midway down the page, generative AI information for students and for educators and for researchers. The one for students has a couple of learning paths that LinkedIn Learning offers some courses, as well as a series of curated resources, podcasts, modules. And then this self-paced course is one that I would really recommend if you're interested in learning more and staying on top of how AI is developing. So I'll put that direct link in the chat as well. But it would certainly be, if it's something that you are interested in, I would really encourage you to keep that focus in your professional development as a graduate student. That was it for me for prompting. Before I pass it to Kim, does anyone have any questions about AI in general, how to use it ethically and responsibly, how to interact and prompt with any of these tools before I pass it to Kim to talk a little bit about academic integrity? no remaining questions. Okay, Kim, over to you.
Hi. Thanks, Erin. I'm not sure if I've popped up there yet. All I can see is Erin, so I apologize. The camera may stay on
You're
you.
there. You're there.
Um, my name's Kim Mason. I'm the manager for academic and research integrity at McMaster University. So that means I oversee two main policies. So the academic integrity policy, which deals with cases involving students and academic dishonesty. And those of you who will be TAing, you will have some interaction with my office and with my colleague, who unfortunately could not be here today, Trish Sarnecki, who is our academic integrity specialist, who will kind of assist you if you have a case involving a student where you need to maybe talk about the process or what you're encountering in terms of that academic dishonesty. The other policy that I oversee as an intake officer is the research integrity policy. So that specifically addresses concerns pertaining to research misconduct. Obviously, quite a very serious concern for any researcher at McMaster. And I encourage you to reach out to me if you encounter any concerns when in your time here, or if you encounter concerns pertaining to any other researcher affiliated to McMaster, and wanting to discuss a potential allegation. But for the purpose of today, we wanted to talk about generative AI, and the concerns as it relates to you in your graduate work, as it relates to the academic integrity policy. So just a couple things I wanted to touch on, because although Erin has been very fun and inviting and exciting, the work that I do unfortunately has me connecting with people a lot of the time when a dishonesty concern has come up. And so I want to first and foremost let you know that you can always reach out to my office. Trish and I are always here to assist you, to answer any questions, even if you encounter a situation where you have a judgment call and you make the wrong call, and now you're having an interaction with a supervisor, where your work is being called into question. Please reach out to our office, have conversations with us about the process so that we can assist you in terms of understanding the process, what your rights are, and avail you of the resources that are available on campus. It's important for you to know that we have a definition of what academic dishonesty is, and that definition specifically states that academic dishonesty is to knowingly act or fail to act in a way that results or could result in unearned academic credit or advantage. And this means that you can be charged even though you may feel that this is the way that you've done things at your home institution. There are expectations, and the policy, although quite large and most students don't read through, a lot of graduate students do. And I encourage you to take the time to read through, to understand, to ask questions of my office if there's anything that isn't clear, to ask questions of your supervisor and anyone you're encountering so that you can avoid those unintentional charges of academic dishonesty. So something that might come up in relation to generative AI may be if the direction from your supervisor wasn't clear around what appropriate use would be. And so you proceeded in using under the assumption that you were doing what was correct, and as a result end up with an allegation being brought against you as it relates to the policy. It's important for you to recognize that there are some pretty significant consequences associated to allegations of academic integrity in your graduate work. And so a first-time charge for a graduate student, if found guilty, the penalty is normally within the parameters of the course. What I see most often is a failure in the course with a transcript notation. And that's a very significant penalty. And so I really encourage you, and I will on the next slide talk about some resources, some ways to protect yourself and to avoid a concern. But it's so important that if you're struggling, if you're having a concern, that you reach out and utilize the resources, that you advise your supervisor that you're having some concerns. We all have unique stressors that affect us differently. And most definitely at the level of study that you're at, you're going to have some pretty significant concerns coming your way. that aren't related to your academic work. And sometimes it gets hard to manage that. And often we find students will engage in academic dishonesty if they're feeling stress in their life and in their academic work. And those are the times when you need to reach out as opposed to taking that opportunity. And the opportunities are very readily available. And some of the companies that work to provide, say, falsified assignments will uh, project an image like they're there to assist you in terms of homework help. And to assist you. They'll tell you that what you're doing and what they're providing to you, if they're writing some work for you to submit academically, isn't academic dishonesty. And really, their end game is the financial benefit to their company. They're not concerned about you, and they're most definitely not going to be there to assist you should you find yourself in difficulty. So, if you do find yourself encountering one of these companies that's offering to assist you and it seems to be a little too good, make sure you ask your supervisor. Make sure you check in with your faculty to say, is it this acceptable use? If a student is found guilty of academic dishonesty at the graduate level, for a second offense or a subsequent offense. The outcome is generally a suspension or expulsion with a transcript notation. That would most definitely also, even if suspension, include a failure in the course. And at that point, you're looking at two failures. And for the majority, if not all, of our graduate courses, that would mean expulsion or removal from your program. And nobody wants to find themselves in a situation like that. Erin, if you could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more positively about kind of what you can do to protect yourself and the measures that you can take to assist yourself. So we have a course, SGS 101, which for those of you who are new, you're very familiar and know that you're going to be completing that in your first term. And this course zeroes in on research and academic integrity and ethics. And it is modules that you're asked to complete. I encourage you to take the time to really dedicate time to that course. If you have questions that come out of that, reach out to my office, to the other offices that are referenced within that course, to ask about how to appropriately move forward. Had a great question come forward last week in terms of the citations and one of the exercises within the course. And we were able to connect through my office that individual with Ben and to provide them hopefully with some clarity around why and how they would appropriately paraphrase versus cite for the work that they were looking at. There are other courses that are available online just generally when you go onto the internet, and you're more than welcome. And some students do complete courses like that just as an opportunity to test out their skill and their knowledge. And I encourage you to do that as well. It's important to protect your academic work. We often see a lot of individuals who were wanting to be helpful to a coworker or a friend, and they share their academic work. Not assuming in any way that that individual would use it in a negative way. And we're all familiar with Turnitin, any past academic work that you've likely submitted to an institution within the world is probably housed in that database. And should that come up as a concern, the instructor who is addressing the concern with the person who's taking your work is also going to want to reach out to you if they can see that you're a McMaster affiliated person to say, why is your academic work being used by somebody else? And that is a potential charge, failing to protect your academic work. So it's really important to make sure that you have your passwords in check, that if someone is asking for assistance, that you kindly advise them that you're not able to provide them with past academic work, but here's some resources you can use on campus that might be able to assist you in being able to best understand or clarify the concerns that you have. And I'm sure Ben will touch on this, but when it comes to referencing, I always encourage you to reference cite all ideas, concepts, facts, phrases, sentences, data, even images that you did not create. If it's an image you have created, I encourage you to as well reference that to give credit so that the person who is viewing that knows where that material has been taken from and that you haven't inappropriately used it. Um, I can see there's some questions, and I'm just going to get through the next 3 points and then I'll pop over to the questions. And I'm also going to finish right at the end with some clarity around Turnitin and authenticate and use here on campus. When we look at why individuals engage in academic dishonesty, one of the main reasons is that they were feeling stressed, that they weren't sure how to proceed. And so the university has some great courses, modules you can do online, sessions you can attend in person, centered around time management skills. What worked for you in your graduate work for your master's may not work for you at the PhD level. What worked in your undergrad in terms of your time management skills may not apply just because the program has changed so much in terms of what's required from you and your dedicated work. So take advantage of those free tools that are available to you, sessions that you can attend to improve those skills so that hopefully when you do get to those time crunch times, you're in your best possible situation to be able to address those stressors that are coming at you and utilize the tools. Use the resources that are available to you. Erin has touched on a bunch of those today. The generative AI site has some phenomenal resources for you as a student, but also in your TA role. Um, there's also resources available through the university librarians. My office is able to assist student success services. And then as well through the School of Graduate Studies, you have a plethora of community resources that are highlighted and key team members that are here to assist you. As well, you're going to get a great opportunity to connect and hear about the resources available through the Writing Center, and that'll be our last slide for today. And then ask for clarification. I can't tell you how many times I will have conversations with individuals where they will say, I thought what I was doing was correct. And, I read it and a past supervisor or a past course, this was acceptable. So I just assumed it was acceptable in this course. Please always ask for clarification, and I encourage you to ask for that clarity in writing. So if you have a conversation around, hey, what's the expectation for this assessment, for the work that I'm doing right now, follow up with an email that says, thanks for that conversation today. I just wanted to clarify that I'm correct in assuming that the following things are acceptable. And if they aren't, please let me know. These are great things to bring forward should someone call in to question your work, especially as it relates to the use of generative AI. You can easily show when you show up to a hearing under an academic integrity policy, you can show that you had permission from your instructor and that it was quite clear or unclear around what the expected use was. And these are the types of things that are really going to assist you in terms of preventing a charge under the policy. So I'm going to quickly touch on some questions here. So how does one protect themselves in group work? For example, I do everything myself for my component of the assignment, but one or more of my team members use AI for the component of their work. This is always a concern, right? Just as in the past, before generative AI was so readily kind of available as a tool, individuals might not appropriately cite work. So I think having some clear expectations for your group around what acceptable use is and having those in writing is always a very good indication. Often, if someone's going to not kind of be bringing 100% to that group in terms of their work, you'll see that showing up in them not showing up for planned sessions or in providing suddenly a bunch of work that you really haven't been able to see progression of that work. And so that would be a time when you might want to follow up with that individual or be honest and reach out to your supervisor, to the instructor and say, I have concerns and I'm not exactly exactly sure how to protect myself in this. There are instances where groups have been found guilty, a whole group of academic dishonesty, and that's usually when an instructor can prove that they were aware that there was a concern and that they didn't attempt to address it. But usually, it's quite easy once the concern comes forward where the individual who's responsible will be held accountable and the other individuals will not be held responsible because they couldn't realistically have known that what the individual is engaging in was inappropriate. Um, and then a quick question, on what basis can a supervisor suspect AI generated information on a student's work? Sometimes these allegations are misleading. You're very correct. There are instances where an instructor will feel quite strongly that someone has engaged in this activity. And once they have that conversation that we require that a supervisor or instructor would have with you about your work, then they're able to see that no, in fact, this individual is able to speak to the work. They're able to answer questions that I have. They can show me progression of work. I always encourage you to keep copies of your work as you're kind of progressing through, save different versions so that when your work is called into question, you can show that instructor, I started work on this specific date. Here's my first draft, second, third, fourth, fifth. It shows them progression of the work. If you've done the work, you're going to be able to speak to any questions that they may have. And we have a little chart that we provided because we don't use AI detectors that allows an instructor to kind of go through and take a look at and ask questions. And so those questions are going to be specific to, did you actually use the generative AI for this assessment? Why did you think it was acceptable to use that? Can you speak to me about the general topics, ideas specific to the work? And I can see Erin is trying to pull that up right now so that it's accessible for you to be able to see what that looks like. Instructors sometimes are and supervisors are not going to proceed with a charge, and that's okay. But that conversation is meant to be an open conversation and an opportunity for you to discuss. Should a charge still proceed and you have written that work, you'll have a chance in a hearing to be able to address it. And I know we're running low on time here, so I'm going to very quickly say our membership to turnitin.com is for instructor supervisor use only. And so that's because a copy is kept of the work that's submitted. We do have the ability for you in your thesis, for master's and doctoral work to be able to submit to a service called Authenticate. That's done via your supervisor through the School of Graduate Studies. The intention is that it allows you to check your work right before that thesis is submitted. For you personally, if you wish to use a service, it would be at your own cost. Authenticate is available for you to check, but I would encourage you instead to ask the question why you feel you need to check that, and maybe instead rely on some of the resources and tools that Ben's going to quickly touch on. Sorry, Ben.
That's okay, no worries. I'll be quick. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ben Taylor. I'm an academic skills program coordinator with the Student Success Center. Previously, I was a postdoctoral fellow working very closely, supervised by Erin, in fact, working on some research with the McPherson Institute on generative AI and higher education. In my current role, I oversee all writing support through the Student Success Center with for graduate and undergraduate students at McMaster. And so I've highlighted here some of the supports we offer through the Student Success Center right now for graduate students specifically. We do have workshops and whatnot throughout the year for undergraduates that you're welcome to join, but we have these specific programs for you as graduate students. And the QR code there will take you to the SGS page. That talks about these services more in depth, but I'll just highlight three of them here. So we do one-on-one appointments that are booked through Oscar Plus. Currently, we don't have a lot on the calendar because the year is just getting started, but you should see some pop up in September. About mid-September, you'll see 3-hour time slots throughout the week that you can book. And this is a great place to talk about the things that both Aaron and Kim have highlighted in terms of making sure that you're being responsible for the work you're producing, for the work that you're submitting. So any written work, citation styles, structuring, ideas, formatting, paraphrasing, all of that stuff our graduate writing advisors who are all PhD students can help with. We also have graduate writing circles that meet. I think in the fall, we have the meeting twice a week for 3 hours at a time. So this is a great place to kind of block time off for yourself to do that writing work. It's really hard as a graduate student. I have experienced this, like making the time to do the writing. So this is a great place to do that. And one of our graduate writing advisors runs these. She kind of helps facilitate by suggesting break times, check-in times, and whatnot. And in the fall, these are both in person and online. So they're kind of a hybrid model. I think most of the rooms are booked in Musk for the in-person version. And I think our writing advisor takes an owl with her, which is this kind of like video camera microphone thing. So you can join online if you can't make it in person and still feel part of that group. And then finally, depending on where you are in your studies, as you near the completion of whether it's your master's or your PhD, and you are working on, your final deliverable, whether that's a thesis, a dissertation, whatever it may be, a long form piece of writing. We run dissertation writing intensives. You can come to them even if you're not working on a dissertation, grant proposal, whatever it may be, even a journal article. But these are 3 days of focused writing with structured breaks and check-ins. Again, they're run simultaneously online and in person, but it's not a hybrid model. So you choose whether you want to be in person or whether you want to be online. We're running one in October during reading week. So it's nice and quiet on campus, and most of the sort of undergraduate activity and student activity is very low. So nice quiet time to join us for 3 days of focused writing. And we'll be doing that in the Learning Commons of Mills Library. I believe it's October 15th, 16th, and 17th. But I'm going to be in touch with the right people soon to get the information updated on SGS's website once the room is booked and we've got everything set up. But we do get food and coffee, so it's like a nice way to like come be part of a writing community for 3 days, get a lot of work done, be very productive. So again, you can check the SGS Graduate Writing Resources page for more information about that. And feel free to email writing@mcmaster.ca, which I check myself with any questions or concerns. And thank you again, Kim, Andrea, Aaron, for the opportunity to come here and talk about these services.
Amazing. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kim. General writing skills, you just email Ben and he'll tell you what you need to know, writing@mcmaster.ca. We are over time, so I'm going to wrap it up just with a general thanks. My email address is on that slide. Kim's is there as well. A reminder that you can get a copy of the slides, download them, read them when you have insomnia at bit.ly/MacGradAI. Thank you all so much for being here. Good luck with your studies. Be in touch. Have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.